Okay, hi, I'm Katie Kane. I'm very happy to be here. I'm happy to be in the presence of my colleague, Bernadette Sweeney. And I'm hoping that this will start up because I did spend a lot of time coming up with slides for y'all. I'll get started right away, other than to say that I am a professor in the English department. I've lived here in Missoula since 1999. I'm from North Dakota originally. I did my PhD work at the University of Texas at Austin, where I studied comparative colonialisms. And specifically, I studied the relationship under colonialism and under its land management strategies of Indian country and Ireland. The first reservation came into existence almost simultaneously, both in Ireland for the indigenous Irish-speaking people and then for Indians in the New World. So there's a really deep structural relationship that can be located between the two communities. Bernadette and I spoke last time at length about lament and the performance of lament in James Joyce's short story, The Dead, and in Riders to the Sea by J.M. Singh. I'm going to shift a little bit away from that tonight, but I'll be harking back to the talk. I want to start in 5 ways, which is not unusual for me. I want to start by invoking the poetry of Seamus Heaney, by citing James Joyce, by making reference to an article by Siobhan Donnelly in Palliative Medicine. The title of this article is Folklore Associated with Dying in the West of Ireland. And then I want to play a clip from an invaluable resource, and I recommend this highly to you. It's called Talking with the Dead. It's on YouTube. I was very happy to discover that. And it's a documentary, an Irish documentary by the ever-brilliant Pat Collins. So it has a little bit of a title that comes before it, True Lives, Talking with the Dead. And it was posted a couple years ago, and as of right now it has 2 views, one of them being mine. So definitely take a look at that. And the documentary is, and this is from RTE's website, is about, quote, the hold that the dead have on the living in Ireland and on the tradition of the funeral in Irish culture. So here's the way I'm starting with Heaney. Heaney, speaking both of Hamlet and of Ireland, says in a poem, or a set of poems, Viking Dublin, Trial Pieces, that Hamlet and Ireland had a habit of, quote, coming to consciousness by jumping into graves. Joyce, echoing the familiarity of the Irish with death, and speaking of Ulysses, said that absence is the highest form of presence. Practically speaking, these epistemic and lyric understandings of our essential proximity with death and the dying are those tools in tradition, the care of the dying and the dead that attends, for example, to the mouth, Bisach and Vas, so that, care for the mouth is very important, both for the dying people and then for the dead. That kind of care. The interdiction, for example, against weeping for 2 hours after the death to allow the being or the spirit to clear the body. The opening of windows for its flight later on, the wake, etc. These tools and traditions should, as Donnelly argues, have much, this is a quote, have much to teach us in the modern era. As a palliative caregiver of Irish traditions, she says, as professionals caring for the dying, we have much to learn from our ancestors' skills and attitudes. By our very expertise and professionalism, we may be disempowering the dead person and their natural carers, who as unpracticed amateurs, we often sideline, forgetting that the foundation of this amateurism is love. Reflecting on the relevant Irish past may challenge the modern direction of palliative care. And so what I'd like to do now is not start with this, but go back to the YouTube video here that I had queued up. So this is Talking to the Dead. And I hope I've got it queued up to the right spot. We'll see here. And I don't run...
Community would turn in their attention towards the bereaved family. Why would they do that? It was in their interests.
I want to go back to 540 here.
That we had the copyright.
Here's the lament that we talked about last time.
It's been said about the Irish that we had the copyright on good grief. That what we did was that we took a scaffolding of ritual and we erected it around a family who had been battered, if you like, by the death that occurred. And what would happen is the local community would turn in their attention towards the bereaved family. Now, why would they do that? It was in their interests, because the health, the mental health of every community depended on the health of each individual cell or family within it. If they were farmers, so they'd let the hay lodge in the field. If they were fishermen, they'd beach the boats. And they took over the business of bereavement. I mean, they fed and watered everybody who came into the house. And the reason they did that was so the family wouldn't be distracted from the work of grieving by being busy, literally. Now, the family were in their own home. They kept the dead body in the house for a number of days to get used to that kind of reality. They shouldered him out themselves. They dug the grave themselves. They filled in the grave. They came back then. They had food and drink and talk and tears and laughter, whatever they wanted to be. In other words, they could be real. And see, that was the whole purpose of it, was to allow them to be real and face the reality, feel the pain, and gradually recommit themselves back into the life of the community.
That was, I didn't say, but that was Christy Kennelly, who is a writer and a student of grief, a scholar of bereavement in Ireland. He is returned to several times in this hour-long documentary. And there is something on Keening that, if we have time, I might come back to. But again, I recommend this film to you. I said that I wanted to start in 5 ways, but I find that I want a 6th in the form of a brief eulogy. I, perhaps inappropriately, dedicate this talk to Gerard Martin Costello, who was waked out of this world and into the other by the strains of Uilleann pipes snaking their way around AC/DC's catalog, and I further dedicate to his daughter, Erin Costello Wecker, my colleague, who knew and kept the old ways. Okay, so at the last talk Bernadette and I gave, I advanced the claim that were James Joyce's short story, The Dead, to be read through the lens of Irish funerary traditions, then Gabriel Conroy's encounter with death in his own life, his soul, quote, swooning slowly as he hears the snow falling faintly through the universe and faintly falling like the descent of their last end upon all the living and the dead, that this encounter could be read as containing potential for rebirth rather than terminating in the modernist reading of paralysis and stasis. The reading that goes, snow is general all over Ireland, and then exile and cunning are our only weapons of escape. We also talked about the Ban Huinta and the Lament for the Dead, Clina Marv, as part of the Irish tradition. And I have to say that that needs to be understood as locally realized. So it's not a general, like snow, all over Ireland. It's very much a locally specific thing, although there are some generalities. So this tradition in which the dead were accompanied out of this world and into the next by singing and wailing from both the other world, the Banshee, and this world, the Ban Huinta. In other words, the practice of lament came from both the other world, what a Western Christian tradition would call an afterlife or a heaven, and this world. So we talked about that, and then we talked briefly about the intimacy, the imbrication, the nearness of the dead and the bodies of the living, the way those two bodies are together in traditional Irish conceptions of life and death. And I said this last time, for the Irish, I'm kind of riffing on Faulkner here, hope he doesn't mind. For the Irish, the dead are never quite gone. In fact, they're not really ever dead. They remain adjacent to us. And I quoted this last time too. Tock Thompson says in his article, The Irish She Tradition, that the Irish otherworld is a very active world of the dead, which coexists on earth with the realm of the living. The other world was variously called the land of the living, delightful plain, and the land of the young. So that's my summary of where we were last time. Now it's to the traditions, or conceptions, I should say, of death in Irish oral traditions that I want to return to today, to speak briefly about the ways in which the dead, death, and the other world were conceived of in traditional Irish notions from the Druidic era to the present, and specifically in popular consciousness. So we looked at, literature last time. I'm interested in sort of how these things get taken up across the Atlantic, around the globe, in popular consciousness. And one way that we can signal the difference in Irish relationships to death, and especially taking into account this notion of an essential proximity, and this is something I just recently learned in doing my research for this presentation, is that there's a strong difference between the relationship that the Irish and Irish Americans have to the graveyard when compared with other traditions. So in many Western and non-Western cultures, the graveyard is a fine and private place, and hence the sacred picnic among the graves, right, of Dia de los Muertos. Or my Scottish-English Congregationalist great-aunt who daily ran her dogs through Linwood Cemetery in Dubuque, Iowa. You would not have had my father's side of the family doing that, because the other world is close to them always, and particularly in the natural world. The Irish and some Irish Americans have a sometimes avowed, so sometimes acknowledged, and often unconscious desire to avoid the graveyard, since those beings not waked out of this world properly and those beings from the other world might be present there. Again, this world and the other world are very proximate to each other. So in moving away from the graveyard and the lament and the wake and into the imaginative or lived experiences of death in Irish culture across centuries and oceans, I spoke last time about the sort of topography of the other world in the she mounds in Ireland that are the visible, tangible topography of the other world. And now I want to spend a little bit more time with that, linger there, map out this topography, and identify some of its denizens. So the other world is right down the way in Ireland in the form of the she mounds, called Avan Ablach by the ancient Irish. The other world was a mirror world, and the living could travel there only very rarely, and by finding the right portals, raths, as we see here, Rath Crogan Mound, and I've got the entrance, an entrance down here. I meant to put a few more images there, but just ran out of time to do that. So, but these raths are seen to be a place where the veil is thin, where there's a connection between the worlds. Also, on my first slide here, there's an old story that you could follow a stag, which is associated with Cernunnos, a figure in turn associated both with comfort given to the dead and the dying and with the other world. The stag, if you ever see him out in the woods, is easily recognizable by its huge size, by its unearthly glow, and its red eyes. So if you see that kind of stag and you're wanting to go to the other world, have at you. Water was also a particularly open conduit, Ireland being a very watery place, that makes sense. Either west over the sea to Techduin, or in waterfalls or rivers where the she might pass, and so might the dead. In the medieval poem, Balia Suthin Sith Auna, it is said that the god Lugh was reared in Avan Ablach. This is the god associated with Lunasa, the harvest festival, about which the great dramatist Brian Friel has written. In another poem from the 14th century, Avan Ablach is described as being filled with swans and ewes. And all this starts to feel a little bit Edenic, especially because etymologically, the word means rapidly moving stream of the apples. And sounds like, oh, great, I'm down with Irish death. Get me to the place where the stream is moving and can have me some apples. I'll be really happy, right? But death in Ireland's tales and traditions, as we know, has since we connected with the Banshee last week, that death in Ireland shivers as well as comforts. And it's no surprise then that a host of formidable and enduring figures of death surround the traditions of Ireland. And when they have these figures, enduring figures of death, when they have that effect, the Donnelly Kennelly note of providing for good grief, I will note that. Because there's a way in which things like the Banshee and the Doulahan and these things I'm going to be briefly talking about contain lessons about good grief and good death and good dying. They're really incredibly interesting. And I suppose for scholars of oral history, there's no surprise there that they're not just, wee fairies or stories, but they contain knowledge, community knowledge. Okay, so in general, the darker versions of death in Ireland are meant to point to the loss and longing entailed in death for those still in this world, and to the darkness that one finds if grief is not allowed to flower and the dead to be accompanied across to the other world. They are cautionary tales, not in the sense of warning, but in the sense of learning. So my first slide, moving, is the Doulahan. And some of you may know the Doulahan. You may know him in the figure of the Headless Horseman, an icon of death who rides the road. He came out of the Celtic world in Europe, lodged in Ireland, crossed the Atlantic, and has found his way into Japanese video games. He's made an appearance in ghost stories around the world. He's also known as the Headless Horseman. The Irish version is a lot scarier than the one we're familiar with, really and truly. The Doulahan, dark man, was a harbinger of death whose origins are in deep, deep Irish history. He's thought to be the narrative incarnation of Crom Dubh, a fertility god who demanded blood sacrifice in the form of decapitation. And I haven't really dug too deeply into the whole focus on heads in Ireland. I'm going to play you a little something at the end of this talk that comes back to heads, but I need to do more work there. So it comes from Crom Dubh, who was a fertility god, and then wanting all these heads. The worship ended with Christianity, so too did his sacrifices, and in some ways he morphed into this, right? One of the most interesting things, the things my kids love, is that his whip is a human spine. So he's unstoppable, pretty much. He comes traveling down the road, calls your name, and there's some sense that maybe some gold might halt him, but really there is not much that you can do to halt him. The Doulahan is recorded in Fairy and Folk Tales of the Irish Peasantry, which was edited by Yeats. And in this book it says, an omen that sometimes accompanies the Banshee is the costa bauer, or the coach bauer in English, an immense black coach mounted by a coffin and drawn by headless horses driven by a Doulahan. It will go rumbling to your door, and if you open it, a basin of blood will be thrown into your face. Yeah, it's quite something. And I think there's a way in which the violence of death and the speed of death are present in both this figure and then in the coach that we're going to see an image of in a minute. And I've just taken these from various artists online. There's quite a fascination with these stories, but I think that they're deeply connected in Ireland to understandings of death. The death can come suddenly. The death comes for you in a very individually specific kind of way. So here's the Costa Bauer, the coach of death. It often attends the Doulahan as he stalks the night, or he can drive it. And here's what Thomas Johnston Westrop says in a folklore survey of County Clare. On the night of December 11th, this is just a historical, a nod to the historical record. A servant of the McNamara's was going his rounds at Enstymon, and this is about seeing the Costa Bauer. In the dark, he heard the rumbling of wheels on the back avenue, and knowing from the hour and place that no mortal vehicle could be coming, concluded that it was the death coach, and ran on, opening the gates before it. He had just time to open the third gate and throw himself on his face beside it at the bank before he heard a coach go clanking past. It did not stop at the house, but passed on. The following day, somebody died. I'm sure that some of you recognize The Koshtabauer, it's appeared in popular culture, and I see there are people of my age here, so of course you will remember Darby O'Gill and the Little People, right? And the coach in Darby O'Gill and the Little People. But it's also the case, and I find this incredibly interesting as somebody who's occasionally taught the Coen brothers, that the Ballad of Buster Scruggs, the very last segment of that film, has a death coach in it. And because they're Americans, they have no clue what's going on, and they can squabble and argue with each other and do not prepare themselves for death, right, as they're hastening toward it. So I find the Koshtabauer really interesting because the focus here is on the compression of the temporal or of time at death, right? Sudden death, as was the case for my father, is unexpected and unanticipated. Thinking about the Koshtabauer helps to prepare you to think about how these deaths might crop up in your life, right? Like it might happen the way a coach comes down the road. For us, it would be a car, but the way that it travels swiftly, right, and anonymously. So here's one more example of, like right now, legit my favorite Irish death creature. I'm just really, really entranced by this. This is a Norse version of the Slua is how it's pronounced, by Peter Nikolai Arbo, and it's The Wild Hunt, and this is painted in 1872. But it's a really good rendering of the Slua. You can see the ground down here. They're high above, right? So Slua na Marv, host of the dead, were the hosts of the dead who linger in this world, and also representatives of a fear that grief can give way to melancholy. So there's sort of two things that the Slua do, and that is, okay, just to sort of slow down here, and I hope I don't repeat myself because I've gotten it all written down, but these are once living human beings who are still hanging around. Maybe they weren't waked properly. Maybe you started to cry right away and the spirit never left the place of its death. But they somehow, and this really predates limbo. Like the first time I saw this, I went, oh, well, that's kind of like limbo. Souls are just hanging around, unrepentant maybe, or, good souls who didn't get back, whatever. I went right there. But in fact, this absolutely predates limbo. I wonder if there's some kind of relationship. But so there are two things the Slua will do. And actually, let me define them just a little bit more. In the words of folklorist Lewis Spence, the Slua, or she-host, was regarded as composed of the beings of the dead flying through the air. They usually approach from above. They fly in patterns similar to birds, so be careful if you see a big host of birds heading your way. Watch them as they get closer. They might morph into the Slua. But actually, you have some ability to fight that off, and I'll tell you about that in a minute. They fly in patterns similar to birds, but are able to approach and pick up and transport a living human, usually, obviously, to their physical detriment or death. However, the Slua primarily steal the spirits of the living and sometimes the dying, if they're not being properly cared for or just prior to their being properly cared for. In Ireland, the Slua are said to come in from the west, so it's one of the reasons, among many, there are other reasons, it's a really overdetermined thing, that there's this tradition in Ireland of keeping the doors and the windows that are facing west closed as somebody is dying or immediately after their death, right? So what I find interesting is there's a warning to take care of the dead properly, to care for their body, to handle their body with respect and with love. But it's also the case that you can call the Slua to you, and one of them's a kind of like Candyman kind of way. You can call them just by saying the Slua, Han Slua, But also you can call them to yourself if you allow your mourning to become debilitating melancholia. So if you lose somebody and you do not return to life in that way that Kinley was talking about, the Slua will look for you, right? It's said, for those who cannot cease longing for their dear departed, the Slua may come to finish the work that was started by the loss of the loved ones. It is the Slua who'll come and not a broken heart. I have other, Irish death creatures, as I'm kind of calling them, that I want to talk about. Like, I want to talk about Auertach, the vampire, especially since one of my ancestors apparently killed the thing. So, but I don't think I'll go there. I do want to talk just briefly, because I'll set you up for this last slide, about the Derek Dew, who's really interesting. Vampires kind of got their start in Ireland. Derek Dew means red death or red blood. It's about a female vampire who drains you of all of your blood. And Bram Stoker knew about these traditions, or at least scholars believe very strongly that he did. So, while Dracula may have some influences coming from Slavic countries, etc., it's also very much a homegrown kind of thing. But I just wanted to end with this. Here's another popular incarnation of these creatures who are close to death in Ireland. This is Derek Doom. They masculinized the female vampire in ways that I think are really interesting, and then turned it into a rock band. I'm not going to do the whole thing, which is too bad, because Johnny Fiend's guitar solo is really great. But I hope we can see this. Oh.
So much better than one.
And you can hear Jim Lockhart starting there on the Uilleann pipes. But that was the heads that I wanted to talk to you about. When the stars go out, you can hear me shout, 2 heads are better than none. 100 heads are so much better than one. So I definitely commend the Horselips to you as well. They came to the University of Montana some like 10 years ago or so now. But that's all I have for you this afternoon, and I'll turn it over to the fabulous, marvelous Bernadette Sweeney. Oh, you've got
it. All right, can everybody hear me? Great. Thank you so much, Katie, for, if nothing else, reminding me of my older brothers with horse lips. Katie and I spoke last week, as some of you may know, and we spoke to, Katie spoke to The Dead by Joyce, and I spoke to Riders to the Sea by John Millington Synge. My name is Bernadette Sweeney, and I'm a professor in the School of Theatre and Dance. I'm from Ireland. I moved here in 2008. And my role here is really to talk about different representations of death and grief in Irish theatre, which is one of my specializations. I did a PhD in theatre in Trinity College in Dublin, and was really lucky to be able to continue my work as an actor and director, while also digging a little bit deeper into some of into the research. And a big part of my research was to place performance at what I felt, pull it in from the wings or the sidelines, and make it part of what was really becoming very well recognized as an Irish tradition of performance literature and of theatre. And of course, at the time, there was an awful lot of commodification of Irish writers in the 1990s and the early 2000s. There were all these posters that you could buy that were, real fodder for the tourists of Irish writers. And they were nearly all playwrights. It was Oscar Wilde and James Synge and W.B. Yeats. Very rarely was there a woman on there, of course, but Gregory made her way on there later. But I was really kind of annoyed by that, quite frankly, as an actor, and really wanted to try to place the work of the actor and the work of the performer a little bit more within what was becoming recognized as a really rich tradition. And of course, I see great value in looking at the scripts and in performance research, script analysis and so forth, and have been really lucky to be able to work with Katie and some of my other colleagues in the English department and in the Irish Studies program. But I'm a theatre maker, and I really feel that it's important when we're looking at the Irish theatre tradition that we acknowledge and recognize the role of performance and the role of time spent together in the theatre. So I'm going to shift our talk a little bit in the direction of a consideration of Irish theatre, and then Katie and I will take questions at the end. So again, we're here at Ashby's invitation and at the invitation of the NEH as part of a much bigger project, which was really, I was originally approached by Ashby about this project a number of years ago, to try to look at how we consider death in the community and to bring all of these different areas of specialization together. And as I said, my area of specialization is in Irish theatre and in performance, ritual, and tradition. And how might some of these traditions help us to reimagine death and conversations about death, dying, and grief? Part of what we've been doing, myself and Katie, today and last week, has been we've been looking at aspects of lament, and we're looking at manifestations and performances of grief in Irish culture. Irish traditions around death, grief and loss that have been staged in Irish theatre include Cuina or keening, which we discussed a little bit last week. Ritual music. Wasn't thinking of horselips when I wrote that, but now I am. Waking the dead and staged absence. And that's something that, as a theatre maker, previously an actor and now a director, I'm really fascinated by how we stage subtext often on stage by referencing what's absent, whether that's through time or referencing a character that's not on stage, or making reference to a presence that's absent, whether it's a spiritual presence or a physical presence. And Beckett, of course, is renowned for this, and I'll get to him in a moment. As I said last week, I talked a little bit about Riders to the Sea and the performance of Cuina or keening staged in the text. Riders to the Sea is set on the Aran Islands off the Clare and Galway coast. I'm from County Clare myself. I've always been really interested in the rhythms of the ocean and how they're so much a huge part of the musicality of Irish theatre and Irish theatre making. With Riders to the Sea, we see how in that play the characters are really struggling to eke out an existence. They're subject to the sea, of course, and its vagaries, but they also get their livelihood from the sea. So they have a really difficult and tenuous relationship there. So there's almost like a staged conflict, if you like, before the play even starts. One of the things I referenced last week was how keening is this performative tradition in Irish culture. And oftentimes, historically, there was a certain amount of there was a dismissive attitude to aspects of traditional Irish culture in high academia. And I really felt it was important as part of my research which was performing the body in Irish theatre, to look at some of these different performance traditions and see how they made their way onto the stage, how in some instances plays actually documented that tradition and safeguarded that tradition by then disseminating the tradition to the audience. So what do I mean by that? So Synge, for example, he went and lived on the Aran Islands in the early 1900s. He documented this livelihood of the Aran Islanders who lived off the Irish coast. And then he included the tradition of keening in his play, Riders to the Sea. So then the play has a very urban life in Dublin. And beyond that, as it's now internationally recognized as a beautifully formed one-act play. And it includes this tradition of keening. So he has, to a certain extent, disseminated that tradition quite widely. Different productions, of course, include the challenge of keening in different ways. And it's a tradition that not necessarily practiced, but it would have been practiced right up until the late 19th century, for example, and perhaps even into the early 20th century. It lives on in different ways, though, in the musicality of grief and in the way in which, it's still in contemporary Irish culture, certainly with any of the funerals in my family, the waking and the time for grieving is very much part of the funerary process. In another play of Synge's, in The Shadow of the, sometimes documented as The Shadow of the Glen and sometimes described as In the Shadow of the Glen, he uses he makes a very melodramatic almost take on the notion of a wake, and the play documents the tradition of waking the dead. The main character fakes his death and his wake to catch his wife in her infidelity. The play opens with Nora, the wife, worrying about the death of her husband and asking a stranger, a tramp who's passing, for help. Again, giving us a sense of the isolation of their home and how isolated she would have been as a young wife. Nora describes her husband as follows: "He was an old man and an odd man, stranger. And it's always up on the hills he was thinking thoughts in the dark mist." She pulls back a bit of the sheet. "Lay your hand on him now and tell me if it's cold he is surely." The tramp replies, "Is it getting the curse on me you'll be, woman of the house? I wouldn't lay my hand on him for the Loch Nehannigan, and it filled with gold." Nora looks uneasily at the body. "Maybe cold would be no sign of death with the like of him, for he was always cold, every day since I knew him, and every night, stranger." She covers up his face and she comes away from the bed. And that's just a little moment of, again, Synge is setting us up right. We know that there's something amiss with this wake and with this body. But I love the playfulness that Synge illustrates there in referencing the coldness of the body and bringing it to the foreground as a reference to the coldness of the marriage. We all recognize in the audience, we recognize the tradition of waking the dead, of having the dead body in the home, being covered, being present in the house. So as Katie referenced earlier in referencing that documentary, to allow those close to the family to get used to the notion of the loved one being dead, or in this instance, the not loved one who actually was not dead. We also see in this early period of the establishment of the Irish National Theatre, the Abbey Theatre in the early 1900s. The establishment of the Irish National Theatre was a form of resistance. It was an act of resistance because the Irish nation wasn't yet free from British colonialism. The Abbey Theatre, founded in 1904, is Ireland's national theatre. Death is staged in really interesting ways in the work of these early Irish playwrights, people like Yeats and Augusta Gregory, two of the founders of the Abbey Theatre, J.M. Synge. Yeats and Gregory worked together to craft a play called Kathleen Ni Houlihan. And Kathleen Ni Houlihan is really a call to arms. It's propaganda. It's quite recognizably propaganda now. It's, again, a little play, a one-act play. The Abbey really specialized in these one-act plays at that time. And in these early political plays, we see death having a very high resonance in terms of its power to move the audience. Yeats himself worried afterwards that that little play of his sent out men that the English shot after the Rising. In the play Kathleen Ní Húllainn, we see Ireland as an old woman, and she comes to the cottage in Killala in County Mayo looking for help, looking for young men to come to fight for her and her freedom and her 4 green fields, which are the 4 provinces of Ireland. We see the old woman in this play references keening as well. We talked about keening last week. She sings, "Do not make a great keening when the graves have been dug tomorrow. Do not call the white-scarfed riders to the burying that shall be tomorrow. Do not spread food to call strangers to the wakes that shall be tomorrow. Do not give money for prayers for the dead that shall die tomorrow. They shall have no need of prayers. They will have no need of prayers." So she sings this song to Michael, the young man, to really give that sense of the heroism that she's demanding of these young men to fight for her, and that these regular rituals of death won't apply because their death will be otherly and heroic. He, of course, follows her, much to the grief of his family. And we all know, of course, from history how history plays out. At the very end of the play, the father asks the younger brother, the 12-year-old, who's standing in the doorway, "Did you see an old woman going down the path?" And he says, "I did not, but I saw a young girl, and she had the walk of a queen." So we see again in this play the transformative power of death and sacrifice for the Irish nation. So here we have rituals of death being used to stage a version of native Irishness. We have rituals of death and their questioning being staged to be a call to arms and propaganda for the Irish to fight in service of Irish freedom. I referenced, there's another play title there called In the Shadow of a Gunman, and that was a play by O'Casey, who came a little bit later. He also wrote in that play, very much set in urban Dublin, to the power of the political sacrifice. And he's really fascinating playwright because he questions that in really interesting ways, and was really, really interested in socialism as well. But we also see representations of death, grief, and dying through absence in the theatre of later 20th century Irish playwrights like Beckett and Brian Friel, who Katie mentioned, Marina Carr, Conor McPherson, and Enda Walsh. And I just want to talk about those and some of the choices that they make in their stagings of death here for a little bit. So many, if not all of you, will have heard of Samuel Beckett, very, very well known internationally, playwright from Dublin, and Brian Friel, author, a playwright of Dancing at Lunasa. That's probably his most famous title. Beckett was born in a well-off suburb of County Dublin, South Dublin, called Foxrock, on Good Friday, April the 13th, which he was very proud of, in 1906. He studied in Trinity. He spent a lot of his artistic life in France, mostly in Paris, and he wrote in French and in English. His works were considered masterpieces of 20th century modernism and postmodernism. His career kind of straddles both of those isms, as it were. His novels include Murphy, Watt, Malloy, Malone Dies, and The Unnameable. He's especially well known for his play Waiting for Godot, first produced in '53, Endgame, 57, Crapp's Last Tape, 58, and Happy Days, 61. His work is very minimalist, sometimes described as absurdist. His characters are often to be found in very bleak landscapes and situations. As a playwright who then became a director, he makes incredibly powerful use of silence, light, presence and absence, gesture and object. And as he is credited now by some sources as being the most widely produced playwright after Shakespeare. So these are two images from two of his plays, Happy Days, first produced in '61, and Footfalls in 1976. I want to bring your attention to the Happy Days image first of all. This is Fiona Shaw playing the character of Winnie. And many of you may know this play. It's pretty iconic in its imagery. She's buried up to her waist for the first part of the play, and then she's buried up to her neck for the second part of the play. And her world is literally shrinking as she becomes more and more buried in this mound of dirt or sand. And it's pretty easy to read this metaphor, obviously. Here we see Beckett is really questioning our notion of existence and why we are here and where we are going with this incredibly powerful image. Some actors refer to this role as the female equivalent of what Hamlet might be for a male-identifying actor. What we see here in this world, in Winnie's world, as it gets smaller and smaller, and it's harder for her to reach her things. Her things are becoming more dilapidated from Act 1 to Act 2, and we're seeing less and less of her. We have a really visceral connection to what this character is feeling, right? We know that the actor is uncomfortable. And that's part of what Beckett is staging for us. He uses our visceral response, our live, shared presence with the actor to make his point about life and death in this incredibly powerful image. And it's one he comes back to again and again in different ways. The image next to it is Footfalls, first produced in 1976. And Footfalls is a character, a woman referred to variously as Amy or May. And she's having a conversation with her mother, who is off stage. And she walks in this pathway of light. Oh, wow, right on cue. The lights disappear. I was just about to say that. And the lights disappear as she is making her pathway in this little band of light on the stage floor. And as the play progresses, it becomes harder and harder for the audience to see her, and it becomes harder and harder for the audience to hear her. And so she becomes more and more kind of prone in her posture. And so again, with light and with darkness and with sound and the absence of sound, he's really bringing our attention to what it's like to be real and to have matter in the world, and using the liveness of the shared experience with the audience to ask questions of what does it mean to exist in this world, and what are our responsibilities to ourselves and to each other. Again, the audience is uncomfortable. We only ever see her in this strip of light, and she has this incredibly prescribed little pathway that she never deviates from. And we have a visceral response and engagement with that. Two other plays where he uses the image of what we can see and what we can feel really centrally are Not I, first produced in '72, and Krapp's Last Tape, first produced in '58. I had the great pleasure of directing another colleague of ours, Michael Murphy, from this media arts program at the university. He's a really fine actor. I had the great pleasure of directing him in a production of Krapp's Last Tape a number of years ago. And that play, it's only 5 pages, but it takes 55 minutes to perform it. And part of that is so much of the action is in the stage directions. So much of what we see is we watch him doing rather than listening. So let me see if this is a different production. This is John Hurt. Let me see if I can get that to work. be ambitious and try and scroll forward. Let's see if that works. So this is a character Crap. And he has recorded himself on his birthday throughout the years. And we meet him at age 69, and he's playing back different versions of himself. So again, Beckett is using time, duration, and presence and absence to bring our attention to questions of our existence. And so what we see is we see Crap present, but we are also conscious of his absence, because we're not with the 29-year-old him, and we're not with the 39-year-old him, we're with the 69-year-old him. And of course, the title of the play is Crap's Last Tape. So we can assume where this is going.
A help before embarking on a new retrospect. Hard to believe I was ever that young whelp. Voice, Jesus. And the aspirations. And the resolutions. To drink less in particular. Statistics. 1,700 hours out of the preceding 8,000 odd consumed on licensed premises alone. More than 20%, say 40% of his waking life. Plans for a less engrossing sexual life. Last illness of his father. Flagging pursuit of happiness, unattainable laxation, sneers at what he calls his youth, and thanks to God that it's over. False ring there.
So in that little extract, we're watching Crap listening to himself from years ago, but he's describing having listened to an even earlier version of himself from 10 years previous to that. And so we have the 69-year-old Crap on stage with us, but we have these other versions of him, these younger versions of him being referenced. I love the moment when the onstage actor laughs with the recorded version of himself. And of course, the actor in the foreground isn't Crap either. It's an actor playing Crap. And so you have almost like it's like a hall of mirrors. But somewhere in all of this is that the essence of existence is being questioned by Beckett. And we are, of course, questioning that live in the theater with the actor performing this. Also, we are very much aware too of the machinery. He's playing with this old tape recorder. He references the word spool a lot. So we're aware now that this is old technology. And in this one, we see he has a very particular pathway. Again, Beckett loves these pathways around his desk. And you can see in this production, which was filmed at Gate Theatre and Irish National Television, RTE co-production, they really built up the stage to show us all of the stuff that he would have been collecting and living in over time. So we see time being staged by Beckett in really interesting ways. And of course, as we know, time runs out. And we know that, of course, in the title as well, this being Crap's Last Tape. This one I'm not going to play just in the interests of time, but this is Lisa Dewan performing Not I. And that play, if you know it, all you can see on stage is the mouth that you can see on the slide on your left as you're looking at the screen. And so this is a short documentary where the actor is recorded getting ready to perform, and all of the things she has to do to be able to perform, where all the audience can see is her mouth moving, and she speaks incredibly quickly as she's performing this piece. And so existence is absolutely stripped back to just the words and just the mouth. Again, but we know in the audience how uncomfortable the actor must be. And so her temporality, if you like, is constantly being underlined by this style of production. Brian Friel, another very well-known Irish playwright. He was born in Northern Ireland, and he actually founded a theatre company in Derry, but lived just over the border in Donegal once the company was well established. But he founded in Northern Ireland, in County Derry, a company called the Field Day Theatre Company. And he founded that with stage and screen actor Stephen Ray in 1980. And Translations was the first production of that company. He's, as I say, well known for writing Dancing at Lunasa, which went on to have great international success and was made into a film version with Meryl Streep. Translations is centred around the mapping of County Donegal by the British forces in 1833 as a very, very obvious exercise in colonialism. The theatrical device that Friel uses is he stages two languages through one. So all the actors speak in English, but the characters speak in Gaelic or in English. So the characters, he writes it brilliantly so that we know when they're speaking amongst themselves, they speak in Gaelic, and then when they're speaking to the soldiers and the powers that be, the colonial powers, they speak in English. So Translations, as I said, set in County Donegal, where Friel had 5 aunts, and his family would have come from there. And he actually wrote Dancing at Lunasa as a tribute to his 5 aunts, 2 of whom died homeless in London years after. The central image of Translations, though, is one of absence. And this is, I feel like, a reach back to the work of Gregory and Yeats with that early work, Kathleen Ní Húlaháin. Absence and death and the political power of that, and what that might mean for a nation emerging or trying to emerge from the yoke of colonialism. In the play Translations, which is set in a schoolroom, in a hedge school or an illegal Irish native school, there are 2 students who are missing, the Donnelly twins, and they're constantly referred to in the script as being not there. I was able to stage this a few years ago for the School of Theatre and Dance here at the university. And it's really interesting. You know that when you read the script, when there's 2 empty stools on stage, it's so much more powerful. Their presence and absence is constantly being referred to. Their presence in other instances, not when we're in the theatre, and their absence when we're in the theatre, these 2 stools that are constantly absent. And we know, of course, that the Donnelly twins are freedom fighters, and their absence is very, very significant for the fate of the town at the hands of the British forces, because they're up to no good. And sure enough, over the course of the play, we're introduced to a character called Yolland. And Friel is really, really clever in that he sets up some of the English forces as very unlikable figures and characters in the play, but the character of Yolland is a really sympathetic character. And of course, he's the love interest for one of the young local girls, Moira. Then he is missing and assumed dead. And so we have the experience in the theatre of forming a connection with this character, who's a very sympathetic character, and then the implications of his absence become all the more powerful. So Friel is using absence and the death of a character to make a very powerfully motivated, politically motivated point. And he's using some of the techniques that we see Beckett using as well, but in a very different way. I'm conscious of time, so I'm not going to go through all of the rest of this, but there are a number of more recent playwrights who are also referencing and staging death, dying, grief and loss in really interesting ways, in ways that we can maybe perhaps learn from in a broader, more culturally informed way as well. Very central to the theatre making of these three playwrights are presence, superstition, absence, and theatricality. Marina Carr was born in County Offaly in 1964. She's from the Midlands. She's very heavily influenced by Beckett. And she, in her plays, she references presence, absence, a lot of classical texts, Greek mythology, Shakespeare. She reimagines and reconfigures some of those older texts. The play that I'm particularly interested in the context of this talk is a play called Woman and Scarecrow, which was first produced in 2006. This is an incredibly powerful play, and it is another kind of a version of a lament. And in this instance, the woman laments herself. We meet a woman on her deathbed, and she is confiding, raging against and with this character, this very nebulous character companion called Scarecrow. And she's really grieving for the life that she didn't have, for the marriage that she didn't have, for the fidelity that she didn't get from her husband. She had 8 children. And Scarecrow references these her voracious motherhood in this monologue here. Scarecrow says, "Numbers. You just wanted numbers. You just wanted to look and say, this one is mine, and this one, and this, and him, and her, and those, and that pair up there in the oak tree, mine, all mine. That's what you wanted. Greedy for numbers. Insatiable for the head count, the leg count. I own 16 pairs of legs, and the 2 that didn't make it, and 8 noses, and 16 eyes, and the 2 that didn't make it, and 16 ears, and 80 fingers, and 80 toes, and reciting their names and ages to knock yourself out after another exhausting day of counting and coveting, and even still wondering if you could squeeze another one in as you slide to your grave." Motherhood, which is often such a powerful archetypal image central to the Irish theatre tradition and the Irish theatre canon, is really being messed with by Carr here. And Scarecrow's condemnation of the role of the mother as again voracious and greedy and just wanting to cheat death by creating more and more children. And in this moment, as Scarecrow says, wondering if you could squeeze another one in as you slide to your grave. It's an incredibly powerful play. It's not for the faint-hearted, but it is again we see death and questions of mortality and what do we leave behind us being questioned in really interesting ways by Carr. Conor McPherson, he's from Dublin. He was born in 1971. Some of his early plays he's very focused on storytelling, and the Irish tradition of storytelling really informs his work as a playwright. The play that really is of interest here is a play called The Weir, and it's built around a series of ghost stories. We see it's in a remote little pub in the west of Ireland, and a woman comes from Dublin, moves into the neighbourhood or the area, and she's clearly grieving. And over the course of this night in the pub, as each of the characters tells their story, she tells the story of how she lost her daughter and is haunted by her daughter, who was drowned as a child. And so we see ghost stories and repetition being used really powerfully as McPherson references the Irish tradition of storytelling. This is from a review of The Weir that appeared in the Irish Examiner, one of Ireland's national newspapers. The reviewer wrote, is quoting McPherson. So McPherson said, "In Irish heritage, in folklore, and in stories of the fairies, I think there is something going on that's deeper than just stories and yarns," McPherson says. "I think it expresses something about the way that Irish people have viewed the world, that's been passed on to us, the way Irish people have understood nature, those religious beliefs, which would be called pagan beliefs now, personified the dark and the lighter sides of nature and of death and all of that. So in the stories of the banshees and all that kind of stuff, we're really hearing the echo of an old religion. I think that's probably why it's so deep in our bones. In McPherson's work, he's very aware that he's referencing a really old Irish tradition of classic storytelling that reaches well before or beyond Christianity. And lastly, I just want to mention Enda Walsh. Enda Walsh is also from Dublin. He's often associated very much with Cork because he came to professional prominence in Cork City. He was the author of Disco Pigs, the playwright of Disco Pigs, which was a huge hit in the Edinburgh Festival and became internationally renowned. It also launched the career of actor Cillian Murphy. He wrote the book For Once, the musical. Some of you may be familiar with that, for which he won a Tony Award in 2012. The play that I'm interested in here is called Ballyturk, and it was first produced in 2016 at the Galway International Arts Festival, and again featured Cillian Murphy. In this play, we see two characters living in somewhere anonymous and just living the rituals of every day. Their life has been reduced to really petty little rituals and arguments. So it's almost absurdist in that way. The New York Times reviewer references how this play was first references, or we can see very much the presence of people like Beckett and Pinter in the use of silence in the play, in the use of how their relationship is staged in the play. The critic writes how Ballyturk traffics unapologetically in literature's biggest theme. I mean, the point or pointlessness of life in the face of death, and how we avoid or embrace our ultimate ends, and particularly how two people block the view of mortality with small talk and its physical equivalents. As two, the other character, observed towards the play's conclusion, all he and one have been doing with their elaborate fantasies in their fantasy village has been filling a room with words, which in one way is what Katie and I have been doing today. But each of these playwrights is using, and again referencing mortality and using the meta experience of going to the theatre and watching life being performed before us as a way of asking us to question our understanding of presence and absence, of grief and of loss, and ultimately of death. And in this theatricalization, this cathartic reinterpretation or imagining of what that might mean, I think that theatre and literature and art have an awful lot to offer us as we try to also wrestle with our own mortality. We have a couple of minutes if anybody has any questions.
You talked at one point about graveyards and the differences between how people in some cultures look at graveyards. My experience has been that whenever we go to Ireland, that's always where my cousins want to go and visit, is the graves. It's not a social thing, but it's a kind of a remembering thing.
Yeah. I mean, and I think that, care for, the ancestors or the dead or relatives or whatever is different than the kind of way in which a graveyard is a kind of inert space in other traditions. Like my great aunt she used to put the back of her station wagon down where there were 7 of us. We'd fight for that, position and then run her dogs every day. I mean, there was no sense of the potential danger there or the sacredness, right? And so, I think in some ways that's a different kind of thing too. And then there are all these stories in the tradition that Bernadette so, adroitly kind of limned for us in drama, but also out in the popular consciousness that say, don't go by the graveyard at night and don't go doing this in the graveyard. No, stay away from it, right? So, but yeah, I mean, but I will tell you too that when I've gone to Ireland, as so many Irish Americans do, searching for connections, to the past, I go to graveyards and I'm always shocked. There's like nobody there, like literally nobody. I'm the only person there for the 2 hours that I'm roaming around looking at headstones. So, interesting. And this is stuff I'm really discovering through this whole event. So I'd be interested in thinking about different ways to use the graveyard space, which is the last thing I'll say is this is a problem when you ask a question of somebody who fills rooms with words. But there's a French thinker, Michel Foucault, who really wants to think about the way that graveyards reflect urban spaces, or arranged spaces, right? And the way that they're laid out, like blocks and, on a north-south axis, and this sort of, home-like dwellings of certain, kinds of, spaces that are present in graveyards. So it's a really interesting topic, I think. Yeah. Thanks for that question.
Bernadette. So I wanted to ask you to go back to John Singh for a second.
Uh-huh.
And so he did a lot of traveling over in the Wicklow Mountains, in
Yep.
that area. So I guess this is kind of a regional question. So would he find the same similarities between like Aran Islands and West Clare, the West Coast, as he would see in, say, the Wicklow, in terms of like keening and
Yes,
care for the dead, I guess?
I think so. Certainly a version of, but you would see, and he very deliberately went to the Aran Islands and he went west to Clare, Galway, of course, and beyond to the Aran Islands, looking for a non-urban, authentic Irish experience, as native as possible. And of course, all those terms are hugely problematic, right? I know Casey brilliantly staged that with his versions of Dublin in the Civil War or in the War of Independence. The bombings in Dublin were just as authentic an Irish experience as the wakes on the Aran Islands. But he was definitely reaching for some kind of performative ritual. And keening was one of those to be found, and waking was another one. Patterns, which maybe brings us back to the other question, was another one. A pattern was a set journey through sacred spaces, and you would there would be a holy well or some sacred space or a series of sacred spaces, and people would chart a pathway along a route or route on Pattern Day. And it was a set route, and they would go on a loop and pray at different points. And that reminds us that, there are sacred spaces in the Irish landscape, and some of those have these Christian functions, if you like, as graveyards or as patterns. But they predate that. They're definitely evident. There's definitely evidence of these being pagan rituals as well, some of which were appropriated by the church and some of which weren't. In the outside of Dublin, you will have seen more of a prevalence of those kind of traditional performance rituals or traditional social rituals, religious or otherwise. But you would still have seen some version of them, even in Dublin. Like I've been to a wake in Dublin that wasn't in a funeral home; it was at somebody's house. So there is still, and there's always, a really fluid relationship between the urban and the rural in Ireland because it's such a small place. And so many people have family that maybe went ahead of them. So like, you go and you stay with your brother when you start college or whatever, but he's only been there for a few years before you. So there's a very close relationship between the rural and the urban as well.
Any other questions? We have time for maybe one more. Yeah.
Do they still do the wakes? I haven't seen one around here for a while.
In Ireland?
Here in the States.
When I first came here, I did a research project called The Gathering. It was funded by the Irish government and supported by the University of Montana, the Irish Studies program.
and the Office of Research and Sponsored Programs. And for that, I set up an oral history project and worked with quite a number of volunteers, some of whom are in the room, and interviewed quite a few people. It was great for me because I was just from Ireland and I was homesick, so I got to speak to all these Irish Americans and feel better. But there was evidence of, in Butte especially, where my husband is from, there was evidence of waking and references to keening. I didn't find any evidence of keening, but there was definitely an understanding of it. There was Wren Boyce. I interviewed this absolutely fabulous person, Tom Foley, in Butte, talking about his experience with Wren Boyce and with wakes in houses. The extent to which that's still prevalent, I don't know. It's all gotten very sanitized in the last 20 years. The extent to which death is being tidied away, that's a real phenomenon. It's not just an American phenomenon. We see that very much in Ireland now as well. But there are still some people holding on to at least the tradition of waking and of bringing the body back to the house.
No, I would say in the gathering you could find that material. And my father died in '69. We definitely had an Irish American, wake for him, both in North Dakota and then in Iowa. So the body was present during really, for me as a 9-year-old, incredibly enjoyable, fun and running and screaming and, playing, and then people just sobbing and no keening, but very much, in the tradition of being in front of the body and, performing, as it were, for the body. I don't know why I keep handing this to you. I'm like, here, have it.
Right. Well, thank you so much. Thanks to Dr. Katie Kane and Dr. Bernadette Sweeney. And thanks so much for joining us.